Thanks, Gary. Thanks for the introduction, and welcome everybody here today. It's great to see some familiar old faces, or older faces, and I'm qualified to say that, so I'm not embarrassed about that one, but also to see some new faces. It's fantastic to see you all here today. I've been invited along. I was very fortunate late last year in November to do a brief tour to Germany and the UK with the Patriots Australia and at the LH Martin Institute on a study mission to look at the German and the UK apprenticeship system. So I was fortunate representing Group Training Australia and our own organisation on that trip. David and Ashley from MEGT also were on a part of that trip. So I'm going to give you my thoughts and information that I gleaned out of the trip and what I thought the standout things were in their system and maybe what we could learn in Australia. Now, remembering the German apprenticeship system is 700 years old, so they've been at it a while, so it's pretty hard for us to replicate that. It's only been around for a couple of hundred years, so it's really ingrained into their culture. So I do thank the TAFE directors of Australia, LH Martin Institute and Group Training Australia for the opportunity to go on the tour. The mission was to support professional development, targeting those TAFE and major industry private training firms involved in apprenticeships and higher level qualifications. And we really focused on probably the apprenticeship system. All of us were on that trip, and people represented not only from TAFE but a wide variety of industry groups as well. Unfortunately, we were representing group training, so we had a major role in that as well. The Germans have a dual system, what they call a dual system. We might think we've got a dual system, but it doesn't resemble much of the German dual system at all. They have 67% of their training is on the job, and when they say 67%, they mean 67%. They don't mean 72% or 90% or 50%. They mean 67% is on the job. So that means 33% of their time is spent at vocational school. Which is really important, just to keep that in your mind at this stage. That does not alter. Vocational schooling is compulsory. Employers would not think or dream of keeping their apprentice away from trade school. It doesn't even come into their psyche, it's not in their culture, and later on I'll talk about a little bit about that. So remembering how your host employers, can we get them to be as cooperative as the German employers are. Vocational subjects they do at trade school, like our students would, but they also do maths, English and other subjects. So part of their 33% of their time is doing their trade school, but also doing more of a traditional school. All students must do English. We're very fortunate. You feel fairly humble when you go overseas in Europe and everybody speaks to you in English, because in Australia we speak English in Australia and that's about it. So you get a bit jealous of what they can speak. But all students do English, and it is the business language of the world. Management of other subjects, and that's where their 33% comes in. All vocational schools are government run. So we don't have any private training providers, they're all government run and government pays for education. Probably this was highlighted in one of our conversations with their department. One of their gentlemen was trying to introduce e-learning, and he said he was really struggling to introduce e-learning, particularly across Germany. Admittedly, it's a smaller country and has a lot more people, so things are accessible. We said, well, how come you can't introduce your Germany's a go-ahead country, look at your economy. He said, education is free, John. You have to pay for e-learning, so that's one of the differences we have in Australia. It's all government provided. There's 350 vocational training programs, which they call apprenticeships. No more, no less. They're not interested in introducing any more either. If you've got a new vocation, you must fit in with one of their 350 and go to trade school. And even when we did a tour of the Airbus factory, they would love to deliver their own training, but you don't in Germany. The training will be delivered by government. The government vocational schools. Most apprenticeships are 3 to 5 years in those 3 to 3.5 years, in those vocational, 350 vocational areas. So there's no early completions, there's no competency-based assessment, which I'll get on to shortly about their assessment and how they complete that. There's 6 months probation into their apprenticeships, and all your group training CEOs and people operating there would love to hear that, because once your 6-month probation is up, the contract is very difficult to break by the apprentice or the employer. It's probably almost a court case to get out of your, what we would call an indenture or your contract, and because of that, the completion rates are 95%. Who wouldn't be so envious to have 95% of completion rate in Australia? Maybe we need to change our culture, because in Germany the parents expect you to do an apprenticeship. In fact, they'd love you to do an apprenticeship, because it's held in very high regard in Germany. Trade school, as I mentioned, would not be missed under any circumstances by the student or the apprentice. In one of our visits, we did ask that of the employer, and I actually asked the question, would you allow your young person to miss trade school? And I had to repeat the question. It's not that he didn't understand English, it was probably better than mine. He just didn't understand the concept that you keep an apprentice away from trade school. I then also asked the apprentice about, so there's no subsidies for apprentices at all to the employers. And the employer must be approved by the Chamber of Commerce to train an apprentice. So the staff must have a qualification to do so. We call a trainer in Australia. If you're having difficulty regarding that qualification, the Chamber will come around and assist you with that. Now, the Chambers of Commerce are obviously different to what we're experiencing in the Chamber of Commerce. It might be an AIG, which we'll hear from. It could be run as a chamber, it might be an industry-based chamber, or it might be what we call a Chamber of Commerce in retail or business in Australia. They have a bigger control than what happens with their apprenticeship system and their employment system. There's no employer subsidies. Employers don't look for subsidies because they've never had them. Not like in Australia where we've been having people on subsidies for 50 years, and employers don't look for them. I did ask that question and got a pretty stark look, and they said, what are you talking about? There's no employer subsidies at all. And there's no apprentice subsidies. The young girl that showed us around one of the factories, we asked, and she understood English. She lived in Australia for 12 months. The Germans do encourage their people when they leave school to go abroad, which is a little bit different in Australia to go abroad. You can go half an hour in Germany to be abroad, but in Australia it's a bit longer trip. This young lass actually came to Australia and worked in Victoria for 12 months. So I asked what apprentice subsidy or what wage assistance do you get? And so once again I had to repeat the question. She said, well, and secondly she said, I've got a job, what do I need wage assistance for? Which is quite a different culture to apprentices in Australia. You wouldn't get that answer. The reality is she was a third-year apprentice who was actually finished at trade school but was starting to attend university, on a part-time basis. Which is quite some difference to what we get in Australia. She had a job, their wage rates were between 700 and 800 euros a month, clear. Do your calculations and you'll see it's not much different to a third-year apprentice in Australia. So you're not as though you're paying a lot more money for these apprentices to actually give you their commitment in training. That's in their culture. Probably there's a little bit of a side, which I haven't got up on the slide here. The Germans are experiencing some difficulties. It was mentioned by Gary before about young people coming into Germany from the EU countries, particularly the Eastern Bloc countries that don't have an apprenticeship culture because it's not been there before in their lives. So the Germans are working with the parents to explain what apprenticeships are, to encourage their young people to put in for an apprenticeship rather than just working with the young person, which I thought was probably something that training could pick up with our migrants and refugees, work with the parents as much as work with the young people and encourage them to apply for apprenticeships if they know what it is. They'll be more receptive to the young person putting in for that job. Government pay for all off-the-job training. There didn't seem to be any fees or any input at all, or any monetary input from the apprentice or the employer. So government pay for all training, but it is a government system. It's not like Australia where we have private RTOs as well. One of the, Thomas, who was a guy on our trip, he's an interpreter. Probably, as I said, most people spoke English, but however, it's an interpretation that you had to grapple with, or they had to grapple with our interpretation of what they were saying. Thomas said to me, German has no natural resources, only our brains. John, we need to use these to make a go of our future. And that's the culture that the Germans have. They obviously look at their economy, look at how they're going, look at their culture, and that's where they come from. They don't have any holes in the ground they can dig minerals out of. They do have a strong agricultural industry, but they rely on their brains, and they're hell-bent on making sure that their young people are trained through their vocational system as well. All employers must be members of the Chamber of Commerce. You can't be an employer if you're not a member of the Chamber. I'm sure a lot of the chambers love that in Australia because you have to pay a fee. Employers complain about it, but they can't employ if they're not a member of the Chamber, particularly an apprenticeship. Exams at the end of the apprenticeship are set by the Chamber, not the vocational school. So all apprentices are examined by the Chamber. It's a 2-day exam at the end of their apprenticeship where it's both written and practical exam, and set by the Chamber. I guess that would make a difference to competency-based assessment. They do have exams at the end of each year, but the major assessment is at the end of their apprenticeship, which is quite some difference to competency-based assessment, which we're fiddling around with in Australia. Gary was talking about apprenticeship time decreasing. That doesn't happen in Germany. They more encourage you to do more training rather than complete your apprenticeship early, or encourage you to do university studies while you're doing your apprenticeship. The Vocational Training Act of 1969, when it was last altered in Germany, actually in their constitution embeds apprenticeships and education in their constitution. The politicians or bureaucrats don't fiddle with it. They've had two, as it was pointed out, we went to England, they've had 2 changes in 40 years. We probably had 40 changes in 2 years. You wonder about our system, like our employers, the hosts don't understand it, we're battling to understand it, and we're dealing with it. That was just one of the standout things in Germany. It was just the fact that they do not change their system. It's not broken, it's going very well, it's 700 years old, we don't need to fix it. I think none of us could hardly argue with the way the German economy is going that there's something wrong with their system. I'd say it's probably, we're a long way behind, probably 600-500 years behind, it sounds like. There's approximately 1.5 million apprentices in Germany. I think there's just over 2 million people at universities, so you can see the strength of their apprenticeship system. I was just doing some calculations this morning to add to that. If you thought there's 1.5 million apprentices, there's 500,000 apprentices roughly a year that are intake in Germany. If you extrapolated that out, there'd be 475,000 new tradespeople coming out each year in the German economy. No wonder their economy's going so well. They're qualified tradespeople coming out in a population of 82 million. Which is a bit of a difference to our people when we're struggling to get young people through a qualified integrated workforce. They have a master craftsman's, which they call it a Meister, which I think is the old master apprentice in Germany, which they still have. They encourage a lot of their young people when they finish their apprenticeship to do that qualification at university. It's the same level as a bachelor degree in Australia. It's the same level as a bachelor degree in Germany. So that's the level of qualifications they encourage their young people to do and get through to. Apprentices are encouraged to continue their studies at university. It sounded a bit easier when I was in Germany, that they were encouraged and it was easy to go through, but upon following that up, it's not quite as easy as it sounds. I did have a couple of emails from the young lady we met at the shoe manufacturing machinery plant, and she did clarify some things more. While she's at university, your external exam helps with your entry level because it's an exam and you get a mark, compared to what you're just competence, and universities don't struggle as much. But also the universities are a lot of vocational universities as well. We did a tour of the Bremen University, which was very good. It's only a small university because it's only 600,000 people live in Bremen, I was told, so that's pretty big. We didn't think of Australia, but they said it was a small university. The professor of vocational education who was talking to us and showing us around was a motor mechanic by trade in his previous life, so we asked the question, how many people at your university would have started their life through an apprenticeship? And it was 42%. So you can see the difference to the Australian system and the German system, where they really encourage that hands-on practical training, but there is those pathways through to higher education. The transition credits to entry in university, not as easy as I said, it's similar to Australia, although probably slightly better. And I guess employers really encourage their young people to do more university study in the system of entry. It quickly became apparent to me and other people on the tour there was probably 4 key drivers in the German system. They have a long-built culture over many years of educating their young people, particularly through the dual apprenticeship system. So it's really ingrained, as I said, by their parents, my employers, and the acceptance is just there. You will do an apprenticeship, and apprentices are put up here, and tradespeople are put up here. Unlike Australia, where I'd say it's been watered down over the years due to our training system and continued fiddling with it. The German government invests to educate all their young people. Education is free, which is probably a little bit of a difference in Australia, and we've moved away from that model. And we won't get into that argument, but that's already happened. Governments, federal and state, do not mess around with the vocational training system and make constant changes. So employers know where they are, apprentices know where they are. They don't have group training companies, because I'm sure they would know where they are. There's no changes. It just happens. We're consistent and constant, which makes life a lot easier through their system. And finally, education and training is embedded into the German constitution and its culture, which I mentioned before. We did a couple of industry visits. One was to Airbus, which was just absolutely amazing, you can imagine. I was fortunate enough to fly over on an Airbus They employ 150 apprentices a year, so we went to have a look at their apprentice trade school and how they train their young people. Obviously, they have a fair, thankfully, they have a fair influence on quality in their training. We're very pleased to hear that. But the Airbus, and then also we visited Clotten and Desma, which was a shoe machinery manufacturing plant, ladies, not a shoe manufacturing plant, which some of the ladies on the trip thought it might be they could get a few pairs. So they made shoe machinery, which is about 1.5 million euros per machine. And each was probably very well automated. But they had a really good culture. We mentioned during the visit to that plant, what about they export a lot to the Asian countries, and we asked, were you concerned about the Asian countries copying your machinery? And the answers come back, no, not at all. They'll only buy one of theirs once. We know that our quality is going to be much better, and the second machine they buy will be one of theirs, and that's what they've worked on over the years. So they weren't afraid of Asian opposition, because they knew it was going to sell their second machine to them, and subsequent machines will be theirs as well. So it was an interesting, we probably were a bit narky on it, and not talking to the Asians because they copied our machinery. They have a different culture to all that. NGOs in Hamburg, we visited mainly, the Chamber of Commerce. The Germans are confident that their dual system will take them well into the future and make them leaders in the world business stage and very competitive in all areas. And I guess Airbus was an example of that. We've just closed car plants. They're actually opening plants. Airbus has plants in Spain, Wales, Germany, and France. Obviously, the German apprentices said their standard is much higher than the French because they drink too much wine, they assured us. So that wasn't that confident because luckily the Germans were putting the wings on the planes, and they also assured us they used 12mm rivets in the wings, not the 3 mils that they use in the body of the plane. That was also assured. So the visit to the Airbus factory and the shoe manufacturer, Desma, was really most interesting. Gave us an opportunity to ask questions of the employers and the apprentices. The apprentices were actually doing the tour with us, so it gave us an opportunity to ask some of those questions, how you might do it. That Airbus, obviously, 150 apprentices. They have each year between 6,000 and 8,000 applications, so how you would sort that out. But you want to be doing physics and maths, and so that's a lot from their local area. They also do encourage their apprentices to travel, so they can work in their Wales plant and their French plant as well. So that was interesting how the acceptance just to travel around the globe is probably not as far as it is in Australia. The contrast, we then went to the UK system, and I was only there for a brief period of time. But what I gleaned from that, and David obviously would be better qualified than me because he works over there, was looking at the Richard Review. What should an apprenticeship in the future, and how can the apprenticeships meet the needs of the changing economy? The English are like Australia and probably worse. In fact, if you read the Richard's Review, you could insert Australia into that instead of the UK, and it would be just fantastic for us because we've got as much problems and we've probably inherited their system, and that's probably where our problems come from. It was not a review as it looked forward, not backwards. That was what they were trying to tell us. And its future strategy attempted to redefine the shape of the system. Have we heard that somewhere before? And we're still messing around. Remember what I just said about the German system, how well and how settled it is, how employers accepted it and they don't change it. There was some thoughts that the British should emulate or copy the German system. They said, that's too hard, it's 700 years old and you just can't do that, so we've got to look at a different way of getting what we can out of the German system and putting it into the English system. So just briefly, the recommendations out of the UK system was apprenticeship should be redesigned. Funny about that. The focus on apprenticeship should be on the outcome. Not that it isn't in Germany, of course. The government should set up a context for the best qualifications. What they're talking about there is industry and organisations should be putting forward their ideas on the best way to train an apprentice and the best way to train their off-the-job training. I'm not sure how that was going to work. I don't think they know how it's going to work either, but that was just one of the recommendations. Test and validation process should be independent and genuinely respected by industry. I guess this is probably taken straight out of the German system. England in the past has been similar to Australia, very similar. They're looking to validate and test their system a lot more stringently, similar to the Germans. Whether that happens is another thing. All apprentices should have achieved level 2 in English and math before they can complete their apprenticeship. I guess this also is a throwback to what the Germans are doing, having their 33% at trade school, but not only are they doing vocational subjects, they're doing their English and maths for first 2 years as well. The government should encourage diversity and innovation in delivering apprenticeships. I guess that's similar to Australia and what they're doing now. Probably one of the differences that I did pick up in England, that the training provider has a lot more influence over the apprentices put on, because there's a lot more penalties from the training provider if the apprentice doesn't complete. In fact, they have to hand the funding back to that apprentice. So that was one of the things that came out of the equivalent of the TAFE Directors Association in England. So there is a lot more input from the training provider. The government has a role in promoting good quality delivery. Well, I would have thought that would happen. Government funding must create the right incentives for apprenticeship training. And this is completely different to what the Germans are doing. The Germans don't have any incentives. I don't think they either will have any incentives. Employers just expect to train for their own good, for their business to the future. Learners and employers need access to good quality information. Government must actively boost awareness of the new apprenticeship model. I'm not sure if that's really going to change the UK or the English system at all to meet some of those recommendations that they put forward. So thank you very much. That's just a brief overview to give you some insight of what's happening in maybe overseas and what the Germans are doing. You look at their economy, you have to say they're doing something right, but we're not doing right. Hopefully we did have a government representative on that tour, and hopefully Andrew will bring some of that back and embed it into our future training for Australia. So thank you very much.